At that moment, some dozen orcs that had lain motionless among the slain leaped to their feet, and came silently and swiftly behind. Two flung themselves to the ground at Eomer's heels, tripped him, and in a moment they were on top of him. But a small dark figure that none had observed sprang out of the shadows and gave a hoarse shout, "Baruch Kasad! Kasad Aiminu!" An axe swung and swept back. Two orcs fell headless. The rest fled. Hey friends, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today I want to revisit the history and lore that surrounds the Dwarvish language of Khuzdul, while looking a bit at the language itself afterwards. I haven't done many videos in the series Tolkien's languages, but I wanted to remake my old video on this topic and try something a bit different and new. Let me know if you all enjoyed this and want more videos like it, as there are a couple languages I have yet to cover. For more information on Khuzdul, check out the related articles and videos in the description and cards. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Khuzdul was the secret language of the Dwarves, taught to them by their creator Aule the Smith. This element of secrecy within the language itself is the reason why it, in its base form, is considered to be a semi-complete language, unlike Sindarin, of which more is revealed, for instance. Of course, there is Neo-Khuzdul, put together by different scholars such as David Salo of the Peter Jackson films, over the years, to more complete the language as they collaborate the language and add to what Tolkien wrote. But if you only consider Tolkien's works purely by themselves, it is far more incomplete than the language of Sindarin. Again, I find this to be by design, as Aule taught the dwarves this language himself, and crafted it himself. And although Khuzdul would in some ways influence the languages of early men, as well as the Númenórean language of Adunaic, of which it was an ancestor, it was rare indeed for more than a few words or names to be shared to other kindreds from Khuzdul. It may be that this had been one reason why the petty dwarves were exiled from their original clans, as it seems Mime the petty dwarf was more apt in sharing more of his language than were the other dwarves. It even seems that the names of Mime and his sons Ibun and Kim were in Khuzdul as well, being their inner names which were usually guarded, instead of the outer names most dwarves used. Gimli, for instance, is an outer name in the common tongue, and none outside his race know his inner name. Not even on the tomb of Balin was his inner name written, nor on the graves of any dwarves for that matter, for fear that others would find and read their inner names. Now again, this does not mean that dwarves never shared parts of their language, as for instance we know that Khazad means dwarves, Baruch means axes, Doom means mansions, and more. We know this through the war cries of the dwarves, like Gimli's from the battle at Helm's Deep, which means axes of the dwarves are upon you. And we know other names through the rare but sometime given names of places, like Khazad-dûm, mansions of the dwarves. Indeed, this always would be a language of lore and culture. While dwarves would learn and use the common tongue, Khuzdul remained as long as the dwarves themselves did, as this language was taught to every dwarf child. While the dwarves would learn and use the common tongue primarily, Khuzdul remained as long as the dwarves themselves did, as a language of tradition and history in old tomes and texts. Now let's look a bit more at the pieces of the language itself, now that we've talked about its history and lore. The language is inspired by Semitic languages, mostly Hebrew, bearing similarities to the pronunciations and forms of that language and similar languages, as well as triconsonantal roots. Even many of the root letters of many words are similar to such languages and are used often, such as KH, N, Z, D, B, etc. Many words are built with those letters in Khuzdul. According to the Lamas, a work of fictional sociolinguistics in The Lost Road and other writings by Tolkien, Khuzdul is the sole Aulean language and influenced the tongues of men in some ways. In the Peoples of Middle-earth, it is stated that Khuzdul changed very slowly over time, like the weathering of hard rock. Again, the articles in the description have greatly aided in the researching of this, as does the History of Middle-earth saga, which is the basis of much of this information. Although each clan of dwarves certainly had their own dialects, speech patterns, and accents, Khuzdul did not change much over the years, which makes sense in accordance with the dwarvish culture. I'm sure that since the dwarves were secretive about it, and it came from Aule, who they named Mahal, Khuzdul had a strong traditional and even religious characterization tied to it. Now, concerning the written variation of this language, at first it seems that the dwarves used some sort of ideographic or pictographic way of writing, perhaps similar to hieroglyphs, like in ancient Egypt. Then, after meeting the elves in the Years of the Trees and First Age, they learned more about Cirth runes, originally devised by Dairon the Minstrel of Doriath. The dwarves surely saw this as an improvement to what they had, and so they would adopt it for their own language. And over the ages they would modify the Cirth runes, becoming Angerthos Moria, likely in the Second Age or early Third Age, the Moria variation, and then later Angerthos Erebor, the Erebor variation, probably in the later Third Age. These variations of Dairon's Cirth runes by the dwarves would make these runes become known as dwarf letters, although they had originally been in an alphabet written by and for elves and their own languages. Thus, these are the kind of runes we see on Balin's tomb, which translate into Khuzdul and the Common Tongue. Of course, moon letters, which could only be read by the light of the moon, was a craft developed by dwarves, and I wouldn't be surprised if they used this tactic for certain Khuzdul, in records or messages only meant for other dwarves. But even then, they might use moon letters and the Cirth runes of either the Moria or Erebor variations to write something only in the Common Tongue and not Khuzdul, such as on Thror's map when Elrond read the moon letters. Perhaps these runes on the map did only translate to Common Tongue, and that is how Elrond was able to read them, or perhaps during his long life of study and lore, Elrond learned some Khuzdul. Of course, the Dwarven runes being able to be translated into Common Tongue was another way to keep the language of lore secretive. When not using the verbal and written language of Khuzdul, there was also the enigmatic Dwarvish sign language called Iglishmek, which is mentioned in the War of the Jewels. But again, we do not know much about the secretive physical language of the dwarves either, and how connected it may or may not be to Khuzdul, but I figure it's still worth mentioning. And that, my friends, is most all I can discern of the dwarvish language of Khuzdul. It seems most all dwarves would keep this language and keep it secret throughout their time in Middle-earth, and it's likely that even scholars of later days would struggle to piece it together, which is why it is so incomplete today, through the lens of Tolkien's frame narrative, which concerns another video I plan to remake sometime soon. And so we come to the end of our tale on Khuzdul, the Dwarvish language. From the tale of Khuzdul, we see that some traditions and culture are certainly worth keeping safe. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this different kind of video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections on Khuzdul? Let me know in the comments below. I really love the lore around Khuzdul, and though of course I wish I knew more about the language, I really like how the frame narrative of Tolkien's works applies here. I am of mannish kind, and so Khuzdul is not for me to know. Thanks again to the sources in the description. They really aided in the making of today's video since this topic is so enigmatic and the small lore about it is spread all about the Legendarium. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons, Adrian De la Torre, Chris Ortner, Kyle Wetzel, Peter Sheppard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, Merton, John Hube, Jennifer Wood, Sam McBee, Matt Sibbach, Quantum Catalyst, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Ben Gardner, Kondar, Reese Jenkins, and Adam Petrolik. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of our patrons, it really means a lot. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the free peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with a video on fell beasts, the steeds of the Nazgul, as well as some theories about their origins. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.